Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 162 and I am the show's host Kyle. On this episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing two events that are going on in Congress. One is the introduction of SJ Res 54, which is the Yemen War Powers Resolution. And this Senate resolution, if passed, would then move to the House and would end the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And then I'm also going to discuss some highlights from a congressional committee hearing headed by Barbara Lee and Justin Amash on the war powers authorities of Congress, the president, and stuff like that. So I'm going to be playing a lot of clips of some really good news coming from some people with some, real power to make some changes at the levels of government. I mean, these are congressmen and congresswomen who are able to go out there and propose new legislation that would end some of these wars. And in one case they have. So kind of exciting stuff going on. I'm pretty pumped up about it, to be honest. I don't know what will come of it, but at the same time, it's better than the stagnation and nobody saying anything at all in Congress. So I'm going to go ahead and discuss that and play a lot of clips for you on today's show. If you would like to share the show, I really appreciate it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or you could just go to libertarianinstitute.org and the show's right there on the homepage. And also check out my brand new website, immersionnews.com. It has tons and tons of different news stuff. All the foreign policy stuff you need to know. It's really taking Kyle's files to the next level, and it's awesome. So I hope all of you go ahead and check that out. All right, so the first thing I'm going to be talking about is I'm start with the Yemen situation. Now, on this show, I'm not going to go into the background of what's going on in Yemen, really, because I did that on a very recent show, and I'm going to link to the show in the show notes page. I think that was 159. But what's happened here is the Senate has introduced SJ Res 54. If you just, go on and look that up on congress.gov, you'll find the legislation right there, and, definitely share it, support it, call your congressman, tell them to do so as well. But what this resolution would do is it would invoke the War Powers Act and force Donald Trump to end U.S. support for the Saudi coalition's war in Yemen. Now, this isn't the only war going on in Yemen. This is just the portion that's targeting the Houthis and the alleged enemies of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen, and is not targeting at all the U.S. drone war and ground operation and counterterrorism operation that's authorized under the 2001 authorization of use of military force, and that targets Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS and any other people in Yemen the United States deems a threat to the United States of America. SJ Res is 54 is very similar, and I think it's just called the Yemen War Powers Resolution, so that's probably what I'm going to refer to it as a bill, House Con Res 81, which was pushed by the House Freedom Caucus and Progressive Caucus, and that would have similarly invoked the War Powers Act to end the United States' involvement in the war in Yemen. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is that since we're going to be talking about the War Powers Act a lot in this show, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973 over a override of President Nixon's veto, which meant that 2/3 of both houses of Congress had to get together to say, no, this legislation is so important that we want it passed. It was passed because I really believe it's the wake of the Vietnam War, and this is something that for me, just being younger, I've had to learn about and didn't necessarily get a chance to experience. So unlike, maybe how I could comment on what happened after 9/11 and the fever and the, war hysteria, I don't know, was there really a public sentiment to push back the war powers of the U.S. government after the Vietnam War? But that's certainly what's often suggested. And so that seems plausible enough to me because Vietnam was just a huge calamity for the American government. And when they passed the War Powers Act, Congress wrote this into the bill, that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostility or into situations where the involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and to continue to be used such force in hostilities or in such situations. And what this is saying is that the president can't just put troops somewhere and say, oh, our troops are there, now they need to fight because they're being attacked. The United States has to get Congress's authority to go fight a war or to go put our troops in a situation or to carry out any kind of military interaction that is going to lead to a war. The War Powers Act says that Congress must either pass a declaration of war, pass some other form of resolution or, I guess, law authorizing the war, which would be similar to the AUMF 2001 or 2002, which authorized the war against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Saddam government, respectively, as a way to go to war, or if the United States is attacked. In the case where the United States is attacked, the president would have the ability to immediately respond with the force of the United States military, and I think they have 60 days for Congress to be able to get together and vote and act and either authorize the war, or either their inaction or a resolution against the war would have to force the president to stop the war. Now, there's also some international law components here. One of the guests you'll hear from the committee is a woman named Rita Simeons. And what she points out is that international law says that even if you're conducting a defensive war, your defense has to be proportional and in, response to what happened. So let's say, for example, that we have a state, a very small and, rather weak state like North Korea attempts to, conduct a small military invasion of China, let's say, just because those two countries share a border. If the North Koreans marched, let's say 10,000 troops and 2,000 tanks into China, and, those troops were destroyed, it wouldn't then be lawful for China to go ahead and nuke and lay waste to the entire country in North Korea. Their response would have to be somewhat proportional. If Congress would be unable to meet in that time, I think then, it just extends the war for another 60 days until which time Congress is able to mount it. Okay, now I've talked absolutely long enough about this. I'm going to go ahead and start by playing the first clip of Bernie Sanders introducing this legislation.
Many Americans are also not aware that U.S. forces have been actively involved in support of the Saudis in this war, providing intelligence and aerial refueling of planes whose bombs have killed thousands of people and made this crisis far worse. We believe that as Congress has not declared war or authorized military force in this conflict, the United States' involvement in Yemen is unconstitutional and unauthorized, and U.S. military support of the Saudi coalition must end. Without congressional authorization, our engagement in this war should be restricted to providing desperately needed humanitarian aid and diplomatic efforts to resolve it. That is why today, Senator Lee and I and Senator Murphy are introducing a joint resolution pursuant to the 1973 War Powers Resolution calling for an end to U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. The War Powers Resolution defines the introduction of U.S. armed forces to include, quote, the assignment of members of such armed forces to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of, or accompany the regular or irregular forces of any foreign country of government when such military forces are engaged or there exists an imminent threat that such forces will become engaged in hostilities, end of quote. Assisting with targeting intelligence and refueling airplanes as they bomb these targets clearly meets this definition.
Okay, so there's the case Bernie Sanders lays out, and I think part of the reason why he lays out this portion of the case so clearly and spends quite a bit of time on, because the whole little press conference they're introducing this was only like 13 minutes long. What happened to HCON Res 81 was that it was getting a lot of support. So what House leadership did is they got together, they looked at the bill, and they said, oh, well, we actually don't need a vote on this because it turns out that the mid-air refueling and whatever support that the United States was providing to Saudi Arabia for their war against Yemen and the Houthis didn't rise to the level to meet the War Powers Act. However, Bernie Sanders pretty clearly lays out how, if we're providing the mid-air refueling that allows their planes to go and drop the bombs, then that's pretty much covered in the War Powers Act when they say if you're transporting other people's troops and to carry out hostilities, then you're using the U.S. Armed Forces in a military way. And it's very important to remember that one of the reasons for this isn't necessarily for logistical reasons, but because how is it going to be perceived by the people who live in Yemen? While the American people, as Bernie Sanders points out, may not know that America is at war with Yemen, the people of Yemen certainly know that America is at war with them. And I think that's going to be something very clear as you listen to the several different people who talk on my podcast today. Now I'm going to go ahead and play Mike Lee's clip really quick in his portion of that statement.
We're involved in mid-air refueling. We're involved in identifying targets. We are involved in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. These are all things that are very significant in that we are providing material assistance to a Saudi-led coalition in the involvement in a civil war in Yemen.
Again, I think one of the keys here, and I want to play from, so you could hear from both myself, who is a libertarian, Bernie Sanders, who is pretty much a socialist Democrat, who, as he says, a progressive Democrat, who a progressive independent who caucuses with the Democrats, and then hear one of the more conservative members of the Senate, Mike Lee, all echoing the same thing, that what the United States is doing in Yemen is absolutely providing support for the Saudi Arabia to carry out the war in Yemen. So, like I said, I think all of you should definitely consider supporting this resolution. I think is really important, and the way to do that would be to contact your senators and tell them that it's important to you. I don't think a whole lot of senators really understand what's going on in Yemen, and certainly don't understand why the war is going on there and why the United States would have to fight for Saudi Arabia in a war that's benefiting Al-Qaeda. So if you could get on the horn and call them up and say, hey, this is what's going on, then that would be really helpful. And again, I'm going to link to my past episode in the show notes page that you call check out. Again, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. And if you check out those show notes, you'll see that our episode where I detailed the whole war in Yemen, I did recently, is pretty clear. And, then you could call up with that information and say, hey, these are all the reasons that the United States needs to immediately end our military engagement in Yemen. So the next thing I want to set up is we have this ad hoc committee put together by Barbara Lee and Justin Amash. I think it's kind of a dual Freedom Caucus, Progressive Caucus in the House thing. And it's basically to look at the current authorizations for use of military force that the president has and what that authorizes him to do. Now, this was really long. It was about 100 minutes. So I think I cut out like the best small chunk of that. I think I probably got like 15 to 20 minutes worth of clips to play for you. So I'm not going to be commenting a whole bunch here. But if you listen to it, you're going to get all the information you need to know. I'm going to start with Justin Amash. I did not keep these, I guess I'll just know, I didn't keep these clips in order. I kind of mixed them up by subject because they kind of bounce around. I think for those of you who, again, link to it in the show notes page, watch the actual committee meeting, you'll see that some of the congressmen, Barbara Lee and Justin Amash, are pretty on top of it, don't seem to really have all that much of a clue as to what's going on here or why. And so like the order of everything is a little disjuntled and disjointed, but there's a lot of really good quotes in here and a lot of really good things that I want to play for you. So I'm going to start off with Justin Amash kind of explain the 2001 authorization of use of military force.
The 2001 AUMF reads, "The President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons." The key words here are planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. Despite this limitation, Congress has sat idly by as 3 different presidents have used the 2001 AUMF to carry out seemingly endless war and justify military actions no one could have imagined when Congress passed the AUMF in the days following the attacks.
All right, so I think Justin hits on a lot of really important themes here. And Justin Amash is a congressman from Michigan. And some of those are that the 2001 AUMF was passed in the wake of 9/11. And if you listen to the text, pretty specifically to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And this has now been used, as Barbara Lee is going to explain in the next clip, in multiple different countries against multiple different groups. But one of the really important things I want to point out is a lot of these groups didn't even exist at the time that the 2001 authorization for use of military force was passed. If we look at Yemen, AQAP didn't form until, I believe, 2006. And ISIS didn't exist until probably 2015 or 2016 in Yemen. Al-Shabaab, again, formed well after 9/11. ISIS, which started from a group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which formed in 2006 and then became ISIS in, I think, 2011 or 2012. Same with Boko Haram. Then the Gaddafi threat was also, Gaddafi existed at the time of 9/11, but there's no indication that Gaddafi provided any support whatsoever to Osama bin Laden. And so when you look at all the interventions that this has been used in, we're well past the narrow intended definition of the 2001 AUMF. And Barbara Lee is going to explain that very well here. She is a congresswoman from California.
As you know, 16 years ago now, almost 17, I guess, I voted against the 2001 AUMF. And I feared that this authorization, and it was written only 3 days after the horrific events of 9/11, I feared then that it would become a blank check for perpetual war. If we look at Congress now, only about 20% of current members were here when we passed that overly broad authorization. Just 20%. 16 years later, the 2001 AUMF has become a blank check for any president to wage war anytime, anywhere, any place, without the consent or oversight of Congress. It's been used for drone attacks in Yemen, bombing campaigns in Libya, and military operations in Somalia. It's acted as the legal underpinning for indefinite detentions at Guantanamo Bay. This authorization has transformed into a catch-all justification for military operations around the globe. Now, an updated 2018 Congressional Research Service report documenting the unclassified uses of the 2001 AUMF shows that it has been cited 41 times in 18 different countries since it came on the books. Now, in 2016, the report showed 37 citations in 15 different countries. Clearly, this is a huge problem, and it's only getting worse.
All right, so I don't have a whole lot to add. I think Barbara Lee puts it very well in that statement. I guess the only thing that I think she could continue to point out, and some later of the guests will, would be that a lot of these groups, like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, formed as a result of U.S. intervention overseas. And so what we're doing is by bombing different countries, we create a terrorist group through blowback. And then that terrorist group spreads to another country, which we now say we have the authority to bomb under the 2001 AUMF. Yet it didn't exist until after we were already bombing the first country. And so that really doesn't make sense. The next clip on the 2001 AUMF is by Lieutenant Colonel who's testifying here, Daniel Davis.
Actually turned out what happened was that you can make a strong case that as of probably the mid-2002, all of the terms of the 2001 AUMF had been met. So by definition, the 2001 AUMF should have come to an end at that time. Now, as it turned out, we expanded that mission considerably because we were supposed to go there to take out the Taliban, to get rid of Al-Qaeda, and if possible, to kill or capture bin Laden. Well, all that stuff happened, or bin Laden was thrown into hiding after that. Al-Qaeda was decimated, and the Taliban was completely annihilated. They were not any kind of a force at all by mid-2002.
So this is a lieutenant colonel who has served in Afghanistan and understands what's happened in Afghanistan. And he's saying, look, if you look at the 2001 AUMF and the conditions it lays out, the Al-Qaeda was defeated, Osama bin Laden was taken off of the battlefield, and the Taliban were defeated in Afghanistan by mid-2002. The conditions of the AUMF have been met. And this puts Congress in a position where they should have either then formed up a new AUMF to put in place, or the troops should have came home at that point. Now, maybe the president needed to be told that, but Congress could have done that telling, and they didn't do that. The next clip I'm going to play is by Congressman Jim Jordan. He is a congressman from Ohio, I believe, and he is questioning the lieutenant colonel from before, Daniel Davis.
I'll recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Chairman. Colonel, in 17 years from now, do you think it's likely we're still in Afghanistan?
Without congressional action, yes.
Under the current AUMF, unless there is some change, you think that is the likely position of the United States of America?
Right now it is. There is no end in sight. There is not even objectives that says if you accomplish this, then we'll end. There is none. There is simply we're going to continue fighting year after year.
So I think this is really important. What Daniel Davis is pointing out is that because Congress has failed to kind of update the objectives after the first objectives were met, now the executive is just doing things in Afghanistan. We keep saying that we need to defeat the Taliban. Well, the Taliban have since regrouped and reformed and now control more country than they have any time since 2002. And so I think this lays out one of the really good pieces and one of the really good reasons why congressional inaction is such a big deal is because if Congress doesn't tell the president, either update the objectives and say what the new goal is after the goal by mid-2002 has been reached, then the president's just going to keep doing things and continuing the war in Afghanistan. And again, as I'll explain, the concept through blowback, which we'll see throughout this, it just makes things worse and worse and worse. Next, I'm going to play a clip from Rita Simeon, who is I believe like some kind of international lawyer, and explains, about the expanded use of the 2001 AUMF.
Continued stretching of the 2001 AUMF undermines Congress's role in the decision to go to war. It blurs the line between war and peace and counterterrorism efforts and undermines national security, U.S. leadership, and human rights at home and abroad. Countering terrorist threats effectively requires a range of tools and approaches. The use of military force is just one of those tools, and one that should be employed only when such force is a necessary, lawful, proportionate, and effective response to a particular threat. Using wartime powers unlawfully or unnecessarily alienates counterterrorism partners, fuels terrorist recruitment and propaganda, and casts doubt on the legitimacy of U.S. actions.
Again, I think she explains this very well, and I don't have a whole lot else to add. Now I'm going to play a clip from Congressman from Ohio, Davidson, kind of explaining just something really interesting about the 2001 AUMF.
And we've had a range of ideas in the White House, in the National Command Authority, that will go everywhere from saying at the State Department, air conditioners are a bigger threat than ISIS, all the way to where if John McCain and John Bolton are somewhere today, I'm sure there's 6 or 7 more wars they would like to be involved in. And that's covered under the same AUMF, the same.
Okay, so I think this is really interesting, and that I think kind of a continuation from what Daniel Davis has said, that now that there's not like a solid objective or like goal from Congress, the presidents are just doing things with this. And so you'll have one president who, is under this philosophy of what they call responsibility to protect, and puts a lot of emphasis on global warming and pollution and stuff like that, versus another one who wants to wage, like Trump, counterterrorism through violating humanitarian law. I mean, the range of ideas is so spread out here, and yet one AUMF covers the whole thing. It seems to pretty much be permission for the president to do anything they want overseas. The last clip I'm going to play, this is a short one, and is Congressman Justin Amash calling for a repeal of 2001 AUMF.
It's time for Congress to reclaim its constitutional war powers, repeal the 2001 AUMF, and debate and vote on a new, narrowly defined reauthorization.
All right, so that one was more just out of joy. Having a congressman call for the repeal of the 2001 AUMF is a great thing. And the more we have doing this, remember, there's 435 members of Congress. And so, checking them off the list, all you need is a majority. It doesn't take that much to convince that many people. As you'll see from this, all the clips I'll play, I play clips from like 5, 6, 7 different congressmen today who all seemingly have the same idea that the United States is doing too much overseas. The next clip I'm going to play is from Captain Michael McPherson, who heads the group Veterans for Peace. And this is his testimony, his opening statement, and I'm really just going to let him explain all because he does it so well. This is kind of a long clip, so just hang in there.
My name is Michael McPherson. I am the Executive Director of Veterans for Peace. I served in the U.S. Army as a field artillery officer, a captain in the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division. I'm here today to give you my perspective on the 2001 authorization for use of military force. The AUMF must be repealed immediately. It would be the best policy for global security and for our democracy. I will never forget September 11. I was working in New York City. Watching office television, I saw the first tower fall. I ran outside and heard people in the street screaming in horror as the second tower fell. I witnessed the fear people felt. But I must tell you that my greatest concern at that moment was not my own safety. I was most concerned with the heart and soul of my country. As part of the 1991 invasion of Iraq, I had seen firsthand and participated in the destruction and violence our military can unleash. I knew that my nation's response had the potential to be just as horrible and more damaging to the world than anything a group of terrorists could ever do. I also knew there would be loud calls for revenge. I got down on my knees and prayed that the nation's response would be measured and contemplative rather than vengeful and selfish. And I actually did get down on my knees. The cost of war to people should compel us to rethink U.S. foreign policy and specifically these current wars. We claim to do this to save lives and protect people, but that is not what is happening. For example, the issue of suicide really stands out for me. I assume that you have heard the number 21 or 22 veterans dying by suicide a day. That is 7,600 veterans a year and families directly impacted by war. I know a mother whose son used a shotgun to commit suicide. She was devastated. utterly devastated by it and haunts her every day. Many times there is profound guilt felt by those left behind after suicide. I know this because I felt it after a soldier I talked to died. I did not really know him, nor had the opportunity to spend time talking to him, yet I asked myself, could I have done more or said something different? Studies and real-life experiences like that of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment show that suicide can become a kind of contagion. At least 14 Marines from that unit have died by suicide. We also know that today the number of veterans with multiple tours of combat duty is the largest in modern U.S. history, with more than 90,000 fighters who deployed for 4 or more times. Studies show that their risk of committing suicide after they return soars because they have a much harder time than other service members adjusting to everyday life back home. And suicide does not end in military families with service members. Perhaps you heard about Carlos Arredondo, a father in 2004, being informed that his 20-year-old son, Lance Corporal Alexander Scott Arredondo, was killed while serving in Iraq, doused a U.S. government van with gasoline, and set it on fire while sitting inside. Fortunately, the Marines who informed him of his son's death were able to pull him out of the vehicle. Carlos and his wife, Melita, are two of the kindest people I know. The unintended consequences of U.S. foreign policy were not done with the Arredondo family. On December 19, 2011, Arredondo's surviving son, Brian, died by suicide after battling depression and drug addiction ever since his brother's death. Though he never saw the battlefield, the pain of war killed Brian. Having spent real time with Gold Star families, I am blessed to know their pain, but I have not felt it. I have felt it. I'm blessed not to know it, but I have felt it. I've cried with them. Fernando del Solar is another parent I know. I met him not long after his son, Marine Lance Corporal Jesus del Solar, was killed in March 2003 when he stepped on a U.S. cluster bomb during the Iraq invasion. Fernando and I participated in a peace delegation to Iraq in December 2003 with military family members. Fernando was able to visit the site where his son died. I believe it provided some solace, but not closure. Thousands of U.S. families are going through this pain. There are thousands of more service members and families facing mental and physical wounds. I have also cried with Iraqis whose children were killed by U.S. forces. I can tell you the pain is the same. Families love each other. Parents love their children. Their children were not insurgents or enemies of the Iraqi government. They were innocent casualties caught in the crossfire of war. One father was simply driving home with his son from their family business. Suddenly, the rear window shattered. He looked back at his son sitting in the back seat and saw he was shot. Medical help did not arrive in time. He watched his son die. I visited the home of a Sunni leader. One of his sons had been trying to work with the U.S. and his community. According to another son, his brother met with U.S. forces several times. One day, a misunderstanding took place, and he was shot and killed. They were not sure why, but they told us they wanted justice, and if there was not justice from the U.S., they would have justice themselves. While there, we heard stories of torture and family members not sure where their loved ones had been taken. As a result, we visited Abu Ghraib. Of course, we could not get in, but there were dozens of people waiting outside to hear word of loved ones. They came every day. The scene both saddened and angered me. The early part of my childhood was during the Vietnam War. Growing up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces headquarters, I was taught that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong tortured our troops. We don't do things like that. Months later, it became clear that the reports were true. I had been standing outside a facility where U.S. personnel were mistreating and torturing Iraqis. Lastly, I want to talk about Rafat. He was a 12 or 14-year-old boy I met in Iraq who had been struck by shrapnel during the U.S. invasion. His family welcomed us into his home. They treated us with no malice as they explained what happened. The shrapnel blinded him in his right eye and mangled one of his legs. And I have pictures of some of the people I'm talking about in the Rafat. Is on the last page, his family and what happened to him. Doctors did the best they could do to save it, but unless he received a higher level of care, he probably lost his leg. It was another heartbreaking moment. All the stories I heard and the pain I witnessed are small examples of the thousands of stories that have and are happening as a result of U.S. wars in countries around the world. I do not see how this can be contributing to U.S. security, and it is clearly immoral. Everything good I have been taught as a child, as an enlisted man, and an officer about our country is being torn to shreds by these wars. I sit here speaking to you today because I'm fighting for the soul of my country. Is it too late to address the fears I had on September 11? Have we lost our soul? Have we distorted our democracy beyond repair? I don't know. I pray not. But I do know that a solid step in the right direction is to repeal the AUMF. History will remember this Congress in a more positive light if it does. Thank you.
I really don't think I am able to add anything in terms of content to what he said. I think it was absolutely brilliant. And I think it's just important to understand that this is what has happened from the 2001 AUMF. And I know most of you who listen to the show have heard me talk about all these consequences of war and, in several different stories and on the grand scheme and in small scale like Michael McPherson just did. But this was said in front of a group of congressmen and, is on record and is up on a congresswoman's Facebook page. This is, as bleak as it is and terrible as it is that these things are going on. Like the fact that we're getting this said in front of Congress, I think is a huge victory. The next clip I'm going to play is a representative from Massachusetts, McGovern, and his conversation that he had with a soldier in Afghanistan.
I remember I was in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, and I would argue that we need to take another look at that authorization as well, given the fact that things have changed. But I met, as all of us do, with soldiers from our home state. So I met with a group of Massachusetts. So Massachusetts people tend to be pretty direct. And a guy said to me, he says, "Do you have any idea what the hell's going on over here?" And I said, "Well, that's why I'm here to learn from you." And then he went into a long, diatribe about how everything's all messed up. And he said, "I can't even tell you what our mission is anymore."
So I just want to play this one. I think, one, it's really good that Congressman McGovern knows this, but two, that he's not pushing every day for the United States to adopt some kind of mission in Afghanistan, knowing they went over there, talked to one of the soldiers from his district and said, "What's going on?" And the soldier said, "We don't have a mission." Now, I'm sure he comes back over to the United States and maybe brings concerns to the Armed Forces Committee and says, "Hey, my soldier just said that." And then they get a statement from the Pentagon, or maybe General Mattis or a different general calls them and says, "No, there is a mission. This particular soldier just isn't seeing the bigger picture," or something like that. But yet he should know, because he went over there and talked to this guy and he told him. And this is reflected in the testimony too, especially that Daniel Davis, who says time and time again, look, the mission was completed, and now we're just doing things all over the world with this authorization. The next clip I wanted to play is switching gears a little bit, and this is Rita Simeon on if Congress were to pass a new authorization of use of military force, this is what it should contain. And I think this is really important. I know that in almost all cases, myself and most people listen to my audience would never want the United States to engage in any kind of war. However, if something like this were to happen, this is maybe a way, these are things that we can advocate for to measure that response and make sure that we could keep it in check of some kind. And so I think these points are really important.
To that end, any new AUMF should include the following 5 elements. First, any new AUMF should specify the enemy, where force may be used, what the permitted mission objectives are to prevent the executive branch from overstepping Congress's intent. Second, any new AUMF should include robust reporting requirements to promote democratic accountability and enable Congress to fulfill its critical oversight functions. Third, any new AUMF should require compliance with international law to demonstrate to our allies and enemies alike that the United States is a nation that complies with the rule of law and is committed to its obligations to respect state sovereignty, human rights, and the law of armed conflict. Fourth, to avoid confusion and overlap, any new AUMF should include language that makes it clear that it is the sole source of statutory authority to use force against the enemy named in that new authorization. And last, but perhaps most importantly, any new AUMF should include an expiration date, known as a sunset clause, that sets a timetable for ensuring continued congressional approval and oversight as the conflict evolves, providing a safeguard against perpetual armed conflict or expansive executive branch interpretations.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think she does an excellent job of laying it out. The only other thing is just make sure that's a good idea. I mean, so many of these wars, and as you were able to see from the testimony of Captain McPherson, it's just not a good idea. It doesn't help anybody. It makes everybody less safe. It kills innocent people. And it's just a terrible thing to do. The next clip I'm going to play is a representative from New Jersey, Bonnie Watson Coleman, who I think is a relatively newly elected representative. And just listen to the question, how she tries to ask it. And then I think the response is important too, though.
Given the fact that we're just so engaged in so many different places, like Afghanistan, like Nigeria, I guess still Iraq somewhat, and other places, can you craft an AUMF that addresses our engagements as they exist right now, giving authorization for what is right now and placing parameters on where we go? And I do agree with sunsets. Or does it require one per engagement?
Well, I think someone can answer that specific question a little bit better than myself, but I would say to you that Congress needs to be clear before you even begin to write an AUMF. What are we trying to accomplish? Because you can write whatever you want, but if you're not clear on what you're trying to do and what some of the consequences are, and the reason that I included the Iraqis in my testimony, other than because I care about people across the globe, is that we created many of the problems that we have right now. And if we continue to do the same things, I mean, just think about yourselves. If the things that were done to people around the globe were happening to your family, how would you feel about it? How would you feel about it, and what would you do? So these are questions that you have to ask yourselves, I believe, before you begin to do anything, so that you can say, well, does this even make sense? But specific to the question, I think the two people beside me can answer better.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right, that the question is, what are you trying to accomplish? Yes, you can draft an AUMF that is very narrow and specific to one particular group in one particular country. You can also craft an AUMF, as there are several AUMF proposals out there that are take a consolidated approach. But I think it's the wrong question to be asking, can we draft an AUMF that just rubber stamps and authorizes everything that we're currently doing right now? The question is, to what extent is military force needed? Where is it needed? Who is it needed against? And why? Do we have an effective plan and strategy in place for using military force? Then once Congress has answered those questions, decided that military force is necessary, then you can craft an authorization that is tailored and specific to those particular instances.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to point out with that question is I don't want to beat up on Congressman Coleman too much because, I mean, she's, she's asking these questions. There's, 400 something members of Congress who didn't show up to this committee hearing. So, but she really can't even describe what America's foreign policy is. She is only able to mention Niger, Syria, and kind of Iraq, which is ridiculous because there's like 5,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. What do you mean we're only kind of there? But then I love the response from Michael McPherson, especially that reflection, like, what would you be doing if these were your families this was happening to? I think that point is so important. I wish maybe he would have referenced one of the families that he had talked about in his first speech, just to make sure they really understand is, if you were in the position of this Iraqi family whose son is now blind and lost most use of one leg, what would you do? How horrified and how terrified and how upset would you be? And so that's really important. Then Ms. Simeon's response, again, very good, outlining that the question is like, is this even worth doing? But then, yes, you do need to craft AUMFs that accomplish specific missions, and you can't just like try to rubber stamp everything the United States government is doing. Like, all of our military actions are the right things to do, which I think is the assumption of every single one, pretty much, other than the few people, maybe Congressman Lee or, the people testifying in this committee. But most people assume that the United States military is doing the right things, and maybe we just need to contain it with a new amendment. The next question is Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky asking Daniel Davis on North Korea war authorization.
Does the president have the authority to attack North Korea?
Oh, clearly not. If him doing something is going to have a reasonable chance of precipitating a response, and we know with almost certainty that it will.
All right, so that's pretty clear cut. I just wanted to point that out. The importance here is that not only is he saying that we obviously don't, under the current AUMF, that the president can't unilaterally do anything against North Korea that's going to involve the United States in a bigger war without first getting authorization from Congress, and that's the War Powers Act. The next two clips I'm going to play are, I think, pretty good and pretty important myth debunking. The first is that if we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them over here. And that's a question asked by Congressman Stanford, I believe of South Carolina. Stanford of South Carolina.
The urban myth is, and you hear it repeated up here, well, we'd rather fight them over there than fight them here. And, the nature of asymmetric warfare is it's difficult, to Mr. Jordan's point, to be specific, measurable, and achievable the way you want things with any normal goal. But this is guerrilla warfare. It's tougher. It doesn't fall neatly into that box. What would be your pushback against that particular?
Because if you're going to, quote, fight them over there so that you don't have to fight them over here, then you need to be in like 57 or 80 different countries, because we're selecting where we want to go. But then we all know from the CIA reports, there are terrorists all over the globe in all these different places. We can't do that, so we're not fighting them there. What we need to do is defend against them here and not create more, as Mike has said a couple of times, by doing all these operations over there that don't even help us. So that's actually counterproductive, not even neutral.
To address what you asked about fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. First thing is that even a moral and just way to look at things? And if we claim as a nation that we're a moral and just nation and we want to be a leader in the world, I don't think that is a right way to look at things. But pragmatically, most people, just like most people in the United States, aren't thinking about what's going on in somebody else's country. They're just trying to live their life. They're trying to take care of their family. They're trying to have a job and create meaning for themselves. But as soon as somebody drops into their country and starts killing their family, all of a sudden they are going to start thinking about that country that dropped into their country, and they're going to want to come over here.
Again, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think both Daniel Davis and Michael McPherson do an excellent job of taking on the question and really explaining why, we don't have to fight them over there or we will fight them over here. This is a myth. It's been used by the war machine for a long time to get their objectives done, but at the same time, it's hurting Americans. The next clip is Justin Amash asking a question about if we have a sunset, because this is what the warmongers will say. They'll say, if we put a sunset clause in, then the enemies know when we're going to leave, and that means that all they're going to do is wait us out. And so we'll get the question and response.
I want to ask one final question. Ms. Simeon brought it up on the sunset for an AUMF. There are people who will say, well, if you have a sunset on the AUMF, then your enemies know when you're leaving, and you can't fight wars that way. Do you have a response to that? And Mr. Davis and Mr. McPherson.
Yeah, that's absolutely false. So the purpose of a sunset, of course, is not to say that the conflict is going to end on that date. No one could possibly know when an armed conflict is going to end. So a 1-year sunset or a 3-year sunset, that doesn't mean that the conflict is going to end in 3 years. That's just, it's ridiculous to think that we could predict that. The purpose of a sunset is so that when you hit that mark, the people, through the representatives in Congress, have to come back together and think about, where are we at now? Do we need to be using military force still? Do we need to make any adjustments? Do we need to expand? Do we need to scale back? And make that decision, and then Congress needs to vote on that decision.
So I think this is a perfect response. And if somebody says this to you, I would pretty much give this response verbatim. There's not a whole lot more that I would add. This isn't, the U.S. government has been passing continuing resolutions forever. So it's not like a situation where every year we're going to have to debate this and it's going to be a huge deal and cause all these problems. The Congress is very good at rubber stamping things, people. I don't think that's something that we're going to have to worry about. That if we pass the AUMF, the sunset clause will always cause a huge political problem. All right, the next couple clips I'm going to play are the congressman kind of addressing the problems, the political problems, as to why nothing is getting done on this issue. The first is Congressman Walter Jones from North Carolina.
It is the most frustrating thing I've ever seen. I made the mistake of voting to go into Iraq in 2002. Afghanistan, AUMF was 2001, as you said. I've signed well over 11,000 letters to families and extended families who've lost loved ones throughout America. From time to time, we still have a soldier or a Marine that's killed in the Middle East, but also Afghanistan. I do not know what we have to do. The one man blocking this debate is Paul Ryan. The Speaker of the House has the authority to order the committees of jurisdiction to mark up a new AUMF. We have written letters individually and also in a bipartisan way. We still have not had a debate. We started that request under John Boehner. No debate. That's why this ad hoc hearing today is very important. But when you really come down to it, the American people need to wake up, because it will be a graveyard with a headstone that says USA. We are a nation that's called a debtor nation. We're going broke.
Okay, so I think the congressman puts out a lot of good things here. One I want to highlight is he talks about the letters he's written to families. Walter Jones has acknowledged that he made a mistake voting for, I believe, both the 2001 and 2002 authorization for use of military force. And in true light of seeing the problem and understanding the true harm that he was a part of by voting for this, has sent letters to the families of dead Americans to say, I'm sorry for what I did. And just I think why he's so frustrated is that he cannot undo this mistake, and there's no reason for it. He's saying, there's no good reasons for these wars to go on, yet we can't get a vote on it, and we just kind of stay put on the issue. The other highlights, I think, were him calling out Speaker Ryan directly. Walter Jones is one of the more conservative members of the Republican Party people, and he is directly calling out Speaker Paul Ryan. And so I know he's retiring, and that's probably why he's getting so vocal on the issue, but a big round of applause to Walter Jones. And then I think the last couple of things, one, the forecasting of an American headstone in Afghanistan. I think that's a pretty vivid image, and hopefully it's something that strikes true with the American people. And as he's explained, I mean, we've gone broke. We spent all of our money on these wars, and now we have to start to make some of that money back, and we got to end the wars. All right, the next clip I am going to play is Daniel Davis explaining what could happen if Congress actually takes their war power seriously.
In terms of the cost and what we're debating, that's one of the reasons I'm such an advocate that Congress needs to debate all of these current military operations. Because if they're debated and talked about, we won't do half of them. I mean, imagine if the current situation in Afghanistan, just so you know, we're basically just doing the same things that haven't worked for 17 years, and we've now instituted them to go forward. Now, if before that was actually put into play by the new administration, there had been, say, a sunset clause where we had to reauthorize. And they sit there and Congress said, all right, what are you going to do? And if they just said, we're going to do the same thing that hadn't worked for 17 years, but we're going to do less of it, well, then no one would have authorized that, and they would have had to do something different. So that's what the big value of talking about this is, because most of them won't be done because they don't make sense.
Thank you. I think this is really important. And just simply having these things up for debate, not all of them are going to get passed, because not all of these wars are a good idea. And so if Congress takes any action at all to start debating these things, it could get very positive very quickly for those of us who want America's military to do a whole lot less. And I think, the first step, Yemen War Powers resolution. So, all right, there's two last clips I'm going to play, and I'm going to play them both together. The first is Michael McPherson on why he thinks that nothing is getting done. And then the last is, I think, Daniel Davis's kind of wind-up clip.
As far as whether or not people care about it, of course they do. You can go out and talk to people, but they are overwhelmed with what is happening in their own lives. People are struggling to make it.
In terms of why the people don't, man, that's been a question I've often asked, and the best I can see is we have this, it's sort of like Mike said a second ago, we have this almost hero worship of the uniform, and like we're always doing all this special stuff for the troops, and they show them on sporting events, they get to throw out the first ball, that kind of thing, and people are just afraid to say anything negative that might seem, because for whatever reason it's termed as anti-military, or if you're quote anti-war, which is even not the case, but if you say anything that questions whether we should be somewhere, it's somehow just automatically associated with that, and so people are afraid of that, even though I think a lot of them do think that.
Right, and I think both of them put it very clearly, and I know this is already a long show, so I'm going to wrap it up here. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com if you want to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. Libertarian Union on Facebook is the page. Me and a whole bunch of other libertarians host really awesome podcasts covering a wide range of topics, more scholarly, in-depth, educational topics on Liberty Weekly. We have the Actual Anarchy guys doing a great job reviewing movies. Trey Weaver and the Subversion webcast, covers a wide range of topics. Don't Waste Your Hate. Great shows on that channel, so check that out. You can also find me on Twitter at KYAAALE. And again, the new website, Immersion News. Check out, everyone. Thanks.